I walked down to the dam at 5:45 with a wrench in my hand and opened the outlet valve for the first time in 11 years.
I didn't make a phone call. I didn't send a letter. I didn't file a complaint or request a meeting or ask anyone's permission. I walked down to the dam at 5:45 in the morning with a wrench in my hand and the original 1961 water rights instrument in my jacket pocket, and I opened the outlet valve for the first time in 11 years. The water started moving almost immediately, quietly at first, just a deepening sound in the pipe, then a visible rush at the downstream end where the outlet emptied into Tally Creek. I stood there for a few minutes and watched it. Then I walked back up to the cabin and made breakfast, and by the time I finished my eggs, the resort's property manager had already called my cell phone twice. I let both calls go to voicemail. The third call, which came 40 minutes later, was from an attorney. That one I answered. I told him, in a calm and friendly voice, that I was exercising my recorded water management rights under Virginia Code Section 62(1)(44)15, that the operation of the outlet valve was consistent with my approved water use permit, and that I would be happy to discuss a negotiated resolution at any time, but that the valve would remain open until that conversation produced an agreement signed by all relevant parties and recorded with the county. He asked what had prompted this. I told him his clients had destroyed my bridge. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said he would need to call me back. To understand why a man opens a dam valve at dawn without warning, you have to understand what was on the other side of the bridge they took down. My grandfather, Walter Emmett Crane, built the cabin on the eastern shore of Lake Tally in 1961 using a combination of his own labor, his brother's labor, and the occasional help of a neighbor named Floyd, who showed up with a chainsaw and asked for nothing except lunch. The cabin sat on 39 acres of mixed woodland that Walter had purchased the previous year from the estate of a farmer who had worked the bottomland unsuccessfully for 2 decades and finally conceded that the land preferred trees to crops. Walter was a civil engineer by training and a builder by temperament, the kind of man who looked at a piece of ground and immediately began thinking about what it wanted to become. What it wanted to become, in his assessment, was a lake. The eastern portion of his acreage contained a natural bowl in the terrain, a low depression where the ground held water seasonally, fed by 2 small tributaries that drained off the ridge above. Walter spent a year designing, and 2 years, building an earthen dam across the mouth of that bowl, creating a 7-acre lake that he named Lake Tally after the larger creek it connected to downstream. He stocked it with bass and crappie. He built a dock on the eastern shore where the water was deep enough to swim from, and he built a wooden footbridge across the narrow inlet at the lake's northern end, connecting his land on the eastern shore to an additional 12 acres of timber he owned on the western ridge, land that was otherwise accessible only by a long road that added 40 minutes to any trip from the cabin. That bridge mattered. It was not a grand structure, pressure-treated lumber, simple railing, wide enough for a riding mower, but it was the connective tissue of the property. The western acreage had the best hunting, the oldest timber, the spring my grandfather had found by following deer trails in dry weather. We had been using that bridge for 60 years. My father had fished from its railings as a boy. I had done the same. My daughter, when she was 9, had caught her first bass by dropping a line through a gap in the planking and waiting with a patience that exceeded her years. The bridge was not a romantic object. It was a working piece of infrastructure, maintained, and functional and privately owned, sitting entirely within the boundaries of my property. I had moved into the cabin 3 years earlier, at 53, following a divorce that had rearranged my life with the thoroughness that significant losses tend to achieve. I had spent 28 years in municipal water management, the kind of career that involves a great deal of knowledge about how water moves and who controls it, and what the legal frameworks look like when those questions become contested. And I had arrived at a point where the idea of living somewhere that had been in my family for 60 years felt less like retreating and more like returning to something real. I repaired the dock. I restocked the lake. I replaced 3 sections of the bridge planking that had gone soft over the winter and painted the railing a dark green that my grandfather had always used. I fished from the eastern dock in the evenings and crossed the bridge on weekends to walk the western timber, which was exactly what 60-year-old hardwood looks like when nobody has bothered it, vast and quiet and completely itself. The lake view. Shores development occupied the western and northern shores of Lake Tally, land that had been separately owned and sold to a developer called Meridian Properties in 2017. While my father was still alive and not paying close attention to what was being built on the other side of his lake. Meridian had developed 42 vacation cottages, a resort clubhouse, a lakefront restaurant, and a marina. They had done it well, by the standards of such things. The architecture was tasteful, the landscaping careful, the amenities genuinely pleasant. They had also done it with my grandfather's lake as their primary selling point, which was a fact I noted without immediate objection because the lake's western and northern shores were legitimately theirs, and resort guests enjoying a lake from their own shoreline was not something I had any standing to complain about. I was not looking for a conflict. I was looking for a quiet place to grow older and fish. The HOA's first communication arrived on a Tuesday in April, 16 months after I had moved in. It was a certified letter from the Lakeview Shores Homeowners Association, signed by the board president, a woman named Sandra Fielding, informing me that my dock was in violation of uniform lakefront standards, that my aluminum fishing boat was not compliant with marina aesthetic requirements, and that my footbridge, my grandfather's bridge, crossing the inlet on my own property, constituted an unauthorized structure affecting the community's visual lakefront corridor. The fine was $150 for the dock, $100 for the boat, and $250 for the bridge, totaling $500 with escalating penalties for nonchalance. I read the letter twice. The bridge was on my property. The dock was on my property. The boat was my property. Nothing in the letter cited any legal basis for the HOA's authority over structures on land they did not own. I pulled up the county GIS parcel map on my computer and confirmed what I already knew. My eastern 39 acres were clearly delineated, and nothing the HOA had listed was within their plat boundary. I wrote a detailed, friendly letter, back explaining this, attaching the parcel map, my deed, and a note about the water rights instrument I held for the lake impoundment. I sent it certified. I kept a copy. The response I received 3 weeks later did not engage with my documents. It stated that the violations remained outstanding, that the fines had continued to accrue, and that the HOA was prepared to pursue all available remedies. I called Sandra Fielding's listed number. She did not answer. I emailed the HOA management company. I received an automated response. I sent a second letter, more formal than the first, citing specific Virginia property law provisions regarding HOA jurisdictional limits and requesting a written response addressing the legal basis for their claims. I received nothing substantive for 6 weeks. Then I received a letter from an attorney representing the HOA, which repeated the violation allegations in more formal language, but still provided no legal theory explaining why an HOA had authority over property outside its recorded plat. I hired Catherine Morris, a property and water law attorney who had practiced in Virginia for 35 years and who had, over those years, developed a comprehensive view of how private HOAs behave when they are not effectively constrained. Catherine reviewed everything I had: the HOA's letters, my responses, the parcel records, the water rights instrument, the dam permits. She agreed that the HOA's position was legally baseless and said she would prepare a formal response that would, in her estimation, end the enforcement campaign within 30 days. She sent the response. The HOA's attorney sent back a letter that ignored it. I was, by this point, not angry in any operatic sense. I was tired in the specific way that comes from dealing with an institution that has decided to outlast you rather than engage with you. 2 months later, I drove down to the western shore after breakfast to cross the bridge and check a trail camera I had mounted on the far side. The bridge was gone, not damaged, not partially removed. Gone. The entire structure, posts and planking and railing removed from both banks, leaving raw gouges in the earth where the footings had been pulled and a gap of approximately 20 feet across the inlet that was now completely impassable without a boat. Someone had removed it cleanly and efficiently, the way professional contractors remove things when they have been paid to do a job. I stood at the edge of the gap for a long time. Then I walked back to the cabin and called Catherine. She told me to photograph everything, do not touch anything, and call the sheriff's department to file a report before moving the earth or the water any further. I did all three. The sheriff's investigation established that a landscaping contractor retained by the Lakeview Shores HOA had removed the bridge under a work order signed by Sandra Fielding and described as removal of non-compliant lakefront structure. The contractor had apparently assumed the HOA had authority over the structure. The sheriff determined there was sufficient evidence for a criminal mischief charge, which was filed. Catherine filed a civil complaint for destruction of private property and trespass. And then Catherine said something that I had been thinking about since I first received the HOA's letters 18 months earlier and had set aside until the right moment arrived. She said, "You own the dam. You own the water rights. The resort's entire lakefront is sitting on a lake you control. I think it's time to have that conversation directly." I already knew the conversation Catherine meant. I had known it since I first reviewed the resort's development permits, which I had obtained through a public records request early in the dispute, and which showed that Meridian Properties had described Lake Tally as a natural lake feature in their state construction permits, a description that was technically incorrect, since Lake Tally was an artificial impoundment created by a privately owned dam in 1963. I had confirmed with the Virginia Department of Environmental Quality that my water use permit was current and that the operation of the outlet valve was within its parameters. I had had Marcus Webb, a hydrological engineer I knew from my water management career, assess the lake and confirm that opening the outlet valve to full capacity would drop the lake level by approximately 3 to 4 feet over 72 hours. Without causing downstream flooding or any safety issue. Everything was in order. I had simply been waiting for the moment that made the conversation necessary. The morning after I confirmed the bridge had been removed on the HOA's instruction, I walked down to the dam at 5:45 and opened the valve. I have already told you what happened next. What I have not yet told you is what happened at the conference table 3 weeks later, when the lake was sitting 4 feet below its normal level, and the resort's floating docks were resting on mud, and the restaurant deck pilings were exposed, to a height that made the structure's construction quality visible in ways the original builders had probably not intended. Catherine laid the documents out in sequence. My grandfather's 1961 purchase deed, the 1963 dam construction permit, the 1963 water rights recording under Virginia's prior appropriation framework, the current water use permit, Marcus Webb's hydrological assessment, the resort's construction, permits with their natural lake description, the DEQ correspondence noting the discrepancy, the sheriff's report on the bridge removal, the civil complaint for destruction of property, and, last, a letter from the resort's primary lender, whom Catherine had notified of the situation since they had a security interest in a property whose central amenity was a lake they had apparently not confirmed the legal status of, expressing concern about the outstanding legal questions and requesting a timeline for resolution. Sandra Fielding, who had signed the work order that removed my grandfather's bridge, sat across the table and looked at the documents in the particular way people look at things they wish they hadn't seen. The resort's general manager, who had not been involved in the HOA's enforcement decisions, and who had the expression of someone who had learned about a problem in his portfolio that morning and was still absorbing its dimensions, sat beside her. 3 attorneys occupied the other side of the table. None of them spoke for a moment after Catherine placed the lender's letter on the table. Then the resort's lead attorney asked if we could take a brief recess. Catherine said of course. The resolution took 11 weeks and involved more attorneys than I will enumerate here. The HOA paid for the reconstruction of the bridge. A new structure, engineer specified with pressure-treated lumber and a railing in the dark green my grandfather had preferred. Sandra Fielding resigned from the board before the settlement was signed, and I have not seen her since. The resort negotiated a permanent water use easement with me at fair market value established by independent appraisal that gave them legal access to maintain the lake level within specified parameters in exchange for annual payments and a contribution to dam maintenance costs. The resort's construction permits were amended to correctly describe the lake as a private impoundment, resolving the DEQ's review. The civil case for bridge destruction settled separately. I closed the outlet valve the day the settlement was executed, and the bridge reconstruction was complete. The lake refilled over 8 days. The resort's docks floated again. The restaurant deck, once the water was back, looked exactly as it always had from the outside. I crossed the new bridge the following Saturday morning to check the trail camera on the western acreage, which had been inaccessible for 4 months. The camera had recorded a black bear in October, a doe and 2 fawns in November, and in December, a barred owl sitting on the branch directly in front of the lens for what appeared to be 27 minutes. I downloaded the images and walked back across the bridge and thought about my grandfather, who had built the original version of it with his brother and Floyd and a chainsaw, and nothing more complicated than knowing what his land needed. He had always said that the important thing about water was not controlling it, but understanding it. Understanding where it came from, where it was going, what it did to the land it moved through. He spent years studying it before he built the dam, and he built the dam because he understood that in this particular terrain, in this particular bowl the water wanted to stay, he was right. It has stayed for 60 years. It will stay for 60 more. The resort guests who paddle across it on summer mornings are welcome to it, now that the paperwork reflects what was always true about who the water belongs to. The bridge is better than the original. I will give them that. The new lumber is straight and true, the railing solid, the footing set in concrete to a depth that will outlast everyone involved in this dispute by a significant margin. I walked across it this morning in the early light, and the lake was still, and the base were moving along the eastern bank in the way they do before the sun gets high, and everything was exactly as it should have been from the beginning. My grandfather would have found the whole business mildly irritating and ultimately unremarkable. He built things to last and recorded his rights carefully because he believed those were the 2 most important things a person could do with land they cared about. He was right about that too, he usually was.